Hi everybody, it's Chris Dyer here and welcome to FAQ. Today's a great day to join us. We're starting a brand new series. We've been looking recently at the book of Esther and we've just finished that. Oh, it was a treat. So many helpful things about the story of Esther and how it relates to our cultural moment with Black Lives Matters and this whole rethinking of our relationship to race. And the book of Esther has a similar challenge on its pages, so have a look at that if you haven't been here before. But I want to start a new series today thinking about how do we build back stronger. The lockdown has made many of us rethink all sorts of things we took for granted. I used to commute into London every day. I used to do all my meetings face to face and no one was willing or able to do digital meetings. Actually, that's all changing. My charity, Home for Good, we never used to do online fostering and adoption inspiration and training events. Now we only do online fostering and adoption training events, and actually that's meant many couples, you don't have to be a couple to foster or adopt, but many couples can come together. They don't have to worry about childcare or all that kind of stuff. They can be together. So there are some wonderful kind of silver linings to some of these big challenges that the lockdown has presented us. And what would it mean for us to build back stronger, that once lockdown is over, we're able to make the most impact that we can with the lives that we've been given? Many of us have noticed that we are making less impact now on the environment. Thanks to lockdown, we're not zooming around the world, we're not driving our cars, we're not getting on planes. We are finding new ways to work, and it's having a really positive impact on the environment. There's a big conversation about how do we re-green the economy? What does it mean to be mindful of those targets of zero emissions by 2050? Is lockdown going to be an accelerant for us to rethink a whole bunch of different ways of living? I'm interested in how we develop a more caring economy. We've been clapping our carers on a Thursday night, and that's been amazing, hasn't it? We've celebrated a new kind of hero. Well, what would it mean for the whole of society to take that seriously? That caring for the vulnerable, caring for one another should be a huge priority. We've seen a massive increase in neighbourliness during this lockdown. How do we make sure we just don't go back to what was before, but we move forward to something more exciting? That's the big question I'm interested in working through. And I thought, where do we go? Well, we've looked at the book of Esther chronologically. The book of Nehemiah is the next best book for us to be looking at. And many churches do the book of Nehemiah when it comes to a building project, because Nehemiah built something. We'll see what it was. And so, if you've got a building project in your church, let's do a series on Nehemiah. And, there's some connections, but there was something bigger going on. There was a kind of cultural shift about to happen, and it's taken a long time for the nation of Israel to get ready for it. And I want to tap into that bigger stream. How do we build back stronger? Not church buildings, but our whole way of life. What can Nehemiah teach us about that? So join me day by day. We're going to look at a different chapter of the book of Nehemiah and look for the parallels, look for the wisdom, look for the insights. And here we go. Nehemiah chapter 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, when I was in the citadel of Susa. Pause. If you were with us for the Esther series, that's the same citadel. The Medo-Persian Empire is still in control. And now the people of Israel, they weren't wiped out by Haman's genocide, as Queen Esther stepped in and Mordecai, her uncle, together kind of worked to make sure that the Jews were protected. In fact, Mordecai became the equivalent of prime minister for the whole region, a Jewish man speaking up for truth and justice within that whole system. So the Jews are still there. They're still in the Medo-Persian Empire. And you need to get your chronology right. I'm pretty shaky when it comes to dates. But around 598, there was an exile, 598 BC, there was an exile from Israel to Babylon. Do you remember? King Nebuchadnezzar takes all of the people there, and, only a tiny, tiny group of people are left behind in Israel and in Jerusalem. That became the kind of main kind of focus of the population. And some people kind of decided to go back around 538 BC. And that was great. But actually, most people didn't. Most people didn't go back. It had been so long that they'd been in exile. They kind of got settled. They got used to their life there. And so they didn't bother going back. And so these events are taking place another 74 years after it was possible, thanks to King Cyrus, for people to go back to Israel, and most haven't. So we're talking about 130 years for many people that they and their families had been in exile. So generations had died, a new generation had been born, and another one on its way. And so it'll be like, for some of you, if you were born in the UK but you have ancestors that go back over 130 years ago that might have come from another country, you really don't have a lot of connection with them. You might not actually speak their language anymore, their customs, their practices. You've become kind of assimilated and you've become an indigenous citizen. So what is your cultural identity now? Why would you want to be going back? If you've been watching the Windrush television program, a man that was kind of brought to the UK at maybe 5 or 6 years old, grows up his whole life here, suddenly told that he has to repatriate to Jamaica. He goes, I've got nothing there. My life is here. Why would I go back? And that idea, that wrench of not even it being within the imagination that he'd want to go back and live in Jamaica, even though it had only been 50 to 60 years. Imagine it had been 130 years. You got even less connection. Imagine you got no phone connections, no travel, no air travel. So it would have been unthinkable to have to go back. So what was the connection with the Jewish nation and the Jewish people? What was the kind of imaginative link between these exiles and now indigenized people and their historic homeland? What is that connection going to be like? It might have been quite distant. Anyway, that's where the story is set. And here we go with Nehemiah. Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province, and they are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, well, hold on a second. So Nehemiah has probably never been to Jerusalem. His father, or maybe his grandfather even, might have been one of the exiles that came to live in Susa. And yet the very thought that the wall around the city of Jerusalem has been broken and the doors have been burnt is so upsetting for him that he takes days to recover and he starts to weep. There does seem to be an imaginative connection, at least, between the idea of Israel and the idea of Jerusalem. They were Jewish, and yet they were indigenized people. They kind of managed a dual identity, and there's quite an important idea here. So I am British, okay, and I am Asian, and sometimes my British identity kind of over spills my Asian identity. So the way we do family is probably a lot more British than it is like my Malaysian ancestry. But there are some things that definitely connect me back to that history, not least the colour of my skin, not least the way that we kind of think about our ambitions and lifestyle. We're constantly on the phone. I don't speak the same language, but I do feel connected with Malaysia, even though I've never really lived there. Now, for Nehemiah, the other connection is the whole faith part. So his Jewish belief, his beliefs in Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the covenant relationship that God had with his people, and the importance of the land and the place of Israel to the faith is really, really vital. So you couldn't offer a sacrifice to God anywhere else except in the temple in Jerusalem. And so somehow, even though Nehemiah hasn't gone back, maybe he wasn't able to go back, maybe he wasn't a free person able to move like that, but still, even though he stayed in Susa, he still felt some kind of connection, even though it had been 130 years since the ancestors had come from that land. Verse 5, then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open. Hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees and laws you gave your servant Moses. Okay, so we're being let into the heart of Nehemiah. And he should remind you of Daniel and actually Esther. He's a leader born into a foreign context and yet still faithful to his God. He's a leader who, as far as we know, doesn't have any kind of major crime to his name. Like we saw with Daniel. Daniel being incredibly upstanding and clean and pure and good. And yet Daniel confessed the sins of his people and his ancestors. And now Nehemiah does something similar. We're noticing with the Black Lives Matters movement, people are awakening to the idea that we might have had privileges because of our ancestors, because of the ethnicity of our ancestors, that other people might not have done. And there's this kind of sense of corporate responsibility for the oppression, particularly of black people. And, you know, the whole question of Britain and the US's involvement with slavery that still has today ongoing consequences economically, psychologically, sociologically for black people. And so this sense of identifying with sins of the past that we need to take responsibility for and move forward. And that's what Nehemiah is doing. He wasn't alive when Israel committed the crimes and sins that meant that they were exiled, but he's still refusing to distance himself from that. He's saying, I have been responsible. My father, my family, and I have been responsible. We were all part of a rebellion against God. Verse 8, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even your exiled people at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. So maybe Nehemiah's feeling this, that I remember the promise, made hundreds and hundreds of years ago to Moses, one of my great ancestors. I remember that you said if we disobeyed you, we'd be in exile. Well, we're in exile now. But if we sought you again, you would be merciful and you'd bring us home, even from the farthest corners of the world. So this idea of a return is on Nehemiah's mind. And it could have been the desolation or the breaking down of Jerusalem's walls that was the thing that woke him up. Maybe that was the kind of lighting up of the homing beacon in him to say, you know what, even though I was born in Susa, I need to go to my spiritual home of Israel. Maybe that was the wake-up call for him. Verse 10, they are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favour in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. So Nehemiah recognises that as cupbearer to the king, he has some positional opportunity. Being cupbearer to the king, I don't know, sometimes I think about him like as a bodyguard, that he was the first guy that would drink the wine in case it had been poisoned, and then he would pass it on to the king. So at one level he was dispensable. A cupbearer was, never mind, better that they die than the king dies. So they were a kind of commodity to be spent on protecting the king. On the other hand, they must be incredibly trusted to be that close to someone that important. You probably know that celebrities and wealthy and rich people normally have an exclusion zone around them that is very, very protected. We saw that in the book of Esther, that no one could go and see King Xerxes, and if they turned up unannounced, he would just kill them. So this exclusion zone was very strong. It was a way of protecting the monarch from the riffraff. And yet Nehemiah's there. So he's in again a paradox, isn't he? So he's born in Susa, but he's Jewish. He seems settled in Susa, and yet there's now a longing for going home and doing something about the nation of Israel. He's a dispensable object that is basically chaff to be in the way of any danger towards the king. But at the other side, he's very close to the king. He's got access. And Nehemiah is recognizing that this could mean a moment for him to make a difference for God's people. And there are some similarities, aren't there, with Esther's story, that however she got to be in the king's harem and to be called the queen, the king's wife, whether that was, and it seems to be through people trafficking and sexual exploitation, even though it was a tortuous route to get there, she still wanted to use the opportunity she had for the God's purposes. And now Nehemiah, cupbearer to the king, realised that he needs to seek God's help, because there's a move that he needs to make. There's a play that he needs to undertake. There's a challenge that is on him, a mission that's set on his heart. And he needs to go and do something about it as he hears about the desolation of Israel and the burning down of the walls and the doors of that city. I love this, and I wonder, in our prayers for the future, what do you see? In many ways, lots of bits of our society are crumbling. Lots of bits of our world and our culture are under a lot of stress right now. We're recognising historic injustices around race and ethnic oppression. We are rethinking, in many ways, what it means to be a nation. Are we one nation in the United Kingdom, or are we really England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? Are we separate nations? Are we going to hold it together? What is Britain's place in the world? Are we going to be generous, or is the end of DFID meaning a new relationship with the world? Lots of things are up in the air. Lots of things that used to be taken for granted are being reconsidered. How can we make sure that we play a good and important and holy and compassionate and loving role in the rebuilding or the building back of what the kind of nation and people we're going to be? And for Nehemiah, he starts with prayer. And the first prayer he's got is confession. God, the first prayer he starts with is acknowledging the greatness of God, that even though all this turmoil is around him, he still wants to keep trusting God. And so he calls God the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love. So he's remembering the awesomeness of God. And that's a great place for us to start in prayer, that no matter what else has changed, God is the God of heaven and he keeps his promises. Secondly, he confessed his sins and recognise his own complicity. So when we're talking about a more caring economy or a greener economy, we've got to realise we've been part of the problem and we need to repent and change. And thirdly, he's asking for wisdom and favour from God, that he might play his part, that he might use his opportunities, his influence, his access for good. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be praying for, that we need wisdom to know. If you're a teacher, a doctor, a nurse, if you're an engineer, if you're a writer or a journalist, if you're a house husband or a housewife, what are the opportunities that God has given you to influence the future and to make an impact? God, would you give me favour? God, would you give me wisdom to play my part well? I think this book is going to set us up so helpfully for thinking about how we build back stronger. So join me again tomorrow in the next edition of FAQ as we unlock the story of Nehemiah and see how it might be helpful for us to live it out in this day and age. Thanks.